What would you do if someone told you to turn an entire army around in 72 hours, march it through snow-choked roads in the coldest winter Europe had seen in 60 years, and then launch a counterattack against one of the most formidable offensives of the war? Most generals would have shaken their heads, perhaps even laughed at the absurdity of it. To shift hundreds of thousands of men, tanks, and supplies in such conditions was beyond the imagination of seasoned commanders. But on December 19, 1944, inside a freezing stone building in the French fortress city of Verdun, one man refused to acknowledge the word impossible. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of Allied forces in Europe, had called an emergency meeting. The situation was dire. 3 German armies had just smashed through the Ardennes forest in a surprise offensive, creating what the world's newspapers would soon call the Bulge. Tens of thousands of American soldiers were cut off, retreating, or already captured. A nightmare possibility loomed. The Germans might seize Antwerp, the vital supply port, and split the Allied armies in two. The commanders around the table, Omar Bradley, Courtney Hodges, Jacob Devers, spoke in clipped, worried tones, reports of villages lost, divisions shattered, and columns of German armor moving west. Poured in by the hour, faces were grim. The Allies had believed the Germans incapable of any large-scale offensive after D-Day. Now, that arrogance had turned to dread. It was at that moment that Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr. rose to speak. He was 60 years old, barrel-chested, with piercing blue eyes and a voice that cut through the room like a blade. He did not ask for time to study the problem. He did not hedge or qualify his answer. Instead, he declared with startling calm that he could disengage his Third Army from its current battles, wheel it north, and attack with 3 divisions in just 48 hours. The room fell into silence. Eisenhower blinked, half in disbelief. Bradley muttered under his breath. Other officers looked at one another, as though wondering if they had misheard. Moving an army that quickly was unthinkable, especially under winter conditions. To most, Patton's words sounded like madness or a lie. Some believed Patton had simply lost his mind, intoxicated by his own reputation. The Germans, if they could have heard him, would have laughed as well. To them, American forces were too soft, too dependent on comfort and logistics, to manage such a feat in the frozen hell of the Ardennes. In Berlin, Hitler and his generals congratulated themselves, convinced that they had achieved the impossible, total surprise against the Allies. Their armies of 250,000 men and 1,000 tanks had poured through the forests, crushing the thin American defenses. But Patton was not bluffing. Unknown to the men in that room, he had already considered such a possibility. For weeks, his staff had been drawing contingency plans. He was a man who thrived on the improbable, who believed destiny itself had shaped him for moments exactly like this. To grasp the weight of his words in that dim, cold chamber, one must imagine the scale of what he promised. He was offering to pivot an army of 250,000 men, disengage them from ongoing combat, march them through frozen countryside, and strike at the enemy's flank all within days. To most military theorists, it would have been as if Napoleon had proposed to move an entire corps through the Alps in a single night. Yet Patton had an iron confidence that bordered on the mystical. He believed that boldness, sheer audacity, could transform the impossible into the inevitable. For him, war was not only a science of numbers and logistics, but a test of willpower, of spirit. Where others saw disaster, he saw an opportunity to carve his name into history. Eisenhower, weighing his options, finally asked Patton the only question that mattered. When can you attack? 48 hours. Patton answered without hesitation. The general's voice carried not arrogance, but certainty. He was not asking permission to try, he was promising to succeed. That declaration would set in motion one of the most astonishing maneuvers of the Second World War. In the weeks ahead, the forests of Belgium and Luxembourg would be filled with the thunder of tanks, the rattle of machine guns, and the cries of men fighting in sub-zero snowstorms. The pristine white landscape would be stained a deep crimson for the Germans who laughed and for the Allies who doubted. The Ardennes would become a proving ground, and at the center of it all stood one man who dared to believe that impossible orders were nothing more than opportunities for greatness. 3 days before Patton stunned his fellow generals at Verdun, the world had shifted beneath the Allies' feet. On the icy morning of December 16, 1944, a sudden roar shattered the silence of the Ardennes. From the misty forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, German artillery unleashed a thunderclap that rolled for miles. Within minutes, thousands of shells rained down on American positions. The ground shook, Trees splintered, and entire outposts vanished beneath the storm. It was the opening act of Hitler's last gamble. The plan was named Operation Whacked am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. On paper, it was audacious to the point of delusion. Hitler intended nothing less than to split the Allied armies in two, seize the port of Antwerp, and force Britain and America into suing for peace. If it succeeded, the Third Reich would gain time to consolidate its crumbling defenses, time to shift divisions east against the advancing Soviets, perhaps even time to negotiate survival. But for the plan to work, it required perfection. The German timetable was merciless. 3 armies, nearly 250,000 troops supported by 1,000 tanks and assault guns, would smash through the thin American defenses in the Ardennes, cross 60 miles of snowbound terrain, capture Antwerp, and cut off the British from the Americans. Every mile mattered, every hour mattered, and above all, fuel mattered. The Wehrmacht no longer had reserves to waste. Its tanks and trucks would need to seize Allied fuel depots. On the move. Without them, the offensive would stall. Why the Ardennes? To most Allied planners, the region was a backwater, a dense forest of pine and frozen rivers, rolling hills and small villages tucked into valleys. The Americans had stationed only green or battered divisions there, thinking it an unlikely place for any major action. Yet to the Germans, the Ardennes was familiar ground. It was through these very forests, in May 1940, that panzer columns had broken the French line at Sedan, delivering the blitzkrieg that toppled France in 6 weeks. Hitler now sought to repeat that miracle. As though history could be forced to replay itself, the strike achieved what even German generals had doubted possible: complete surprise. Allied intelligence had been blind. For weeks, German divisions had moved under cover of darkness, radio silent, their columns hidden beneath camouflage netting. Even Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights were minimized to avoid tipping the enemy off. When the attack came, American sentries were still sipping morning coffee, believing the war was winding down and that Germany had little fight left in it. Then came the tanks. Panthers and Tigers surged from the forests, their engines growling like beasts in the snow. They rolled over roadblocks, scattering terrified infantry. Entire American units crumbled, some surrendering in shock, others fleeing west in disarray. Villages like Clairvaux, Hopefulise, and St. Vith were engulfed in fire and smoke. Communications broke down. Commanders lost track of their men. Within hours, German columns had pushed 20 miles into Allied lines. Newspapers later described it as a bulge in the front of protrusion swelling westward, threatening to split the Allied armies apart. To the Germans, it was vindication. Officers congratulated each other, convinced the Americans had proven weak, soft, incapable of resisting a winter assault. Hitler himself, in his Wolf's Lair headquarters, boasted that the offensive would rival the great victories of Frederick the Great. Yet even in these first days, cracks showed beneath the surface of German triumph. Their assault divisions were not the unstoppable juggernaut of 1940. Among the hardened SS veterans and panzer crews marched boys barely out of school, and gray-haired reservists dragged from civilian life. Supplies were thin, morale brittle, and the Luftwaffe a shadow of its former self. The gamble depended on speed, lightning speed, and any delay would spell disaster. Still, for the Americans caught in those opening hours, none of this mattered. For them, it felt like the sky had fallen, frozen, underdressed, unprepared. They stumbled back through snow and mud, chased by German armor. Command posts were abandoned in panic, roads clogged with refugees and retreating troops. Entire regiments disappeared, swallowed by the forest. In those first chaotic days, it seemed Hitler's gamble might just work. The Allies had been arrogant, blind, and complacent. Now they were scrambling to hold their collapsing lines. At Antwerp, dock workers and civilians waited nervously, hearing rumors that German tanks might appear in their streets within a week. It was into this storm that George S. Patton and his Third Army would soon march. The Germans believed their winter offensive had given them destiny's final chance, but destiny, as it turned out, had chosen someone else. If Falaise was a trap waiting to be closed, then George S. Patton was the man who lived his entire life preparing to spring it. Patton was no ordinary general. He was a man forged in a different mold, restless, theatrical, sometimes reckless, but always driven by an obsession with speed and decisive action. Long before Normandy, Patton had studied war not merely as science, but as art. He devoured history, memorized Napoleon's campaigns, and trained himself with the belief that one day destiny would call on him to command in the greatest war of all. He wasn't wrong. The making of a warrior Patton's upbringing in California was steeped in tales of his ancestors' fighters. In the American Revolution and the Civil War, to him, battle was not just duty, but heritage. Even as a cadet at West Point, he projected a fiery intensity that unsettled peers and superiors alike. He rode horses with a knight's pride, fenced with an Olympian's precision, and carried himself with the swagger of someone convinced that war would be his life's stage. When the Great War came in 1917, Patton found his weapon, the tank. To most generals, tanks were clumsy steel beasts. To Patton, they were the future of warfare. He drove them forward at St. Mihiel and Meuse-Argonne, testing the idea of armored thrusts breaking open enemy lines. That vision never left him. Between wars, restless energy the interwar years only deepened his conviction. While armies worldwide clung to infantry doctrines, Patton refined his ideas about mobility and shock. He wrote papers predicting that the next great conflict would be won by bold armored spearheads, striking deep into enemy territory. He also drilled himself and his men relentlessly, earning the nickname Old Blood and Guts. His philosophy was simple: the more a soldier sweats in training, the less he bleeds in war. This relentless preparation made him a natural leader when the Second World War erupted. In North Africa and Sicily, he proved himself a master of the rapid advance, outflanking enemies and seizing ground with breathtaking audacity. But his temper and theatrics often overshadowed his brilliance. The infamous slapping incidents nearly ended his career, and Eisenhower had to carefully balance Patton's genius with the political fallout he generated. Still, when the Allies needed speed, real speed, Patton was always the answer. Normandy, the role of a decoy by 1944. Patton's reputation was so formidable that the Germans feared him above any Allied general. They believed he would lead the main invasion force. Eisenhower cleverly exploited this, making Patton the centerpiece of a deception campaign. The fictitious First U.S. Army Group, inflatable tanks, fake radio chatter, and Patton's own presence convinced the Germans that the Allies would land at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. It worked. For weeks after D-Day, Hitler kept vital divisions in reserve, waiting for Patton's real invasion that never came. Ironically, Patton's absence was as powerful as his presence. But Eisenhower could not keep his most aggressive general on the sidelines forever. Once the Normandy beachhead was secure, Patton was unleashed. The Third Army awakens on August 1, 1944. Patton's Third Army roared into action. The pace was unlike anything seen on the Western Front. His divisions cut across France with stunning speed, bypassing strongholds, encircling enemy pockets, and disrupting German communications. To his men, he was both inspiration and demand, pushing them to move further, faster, never allowing the enemy time to regroup. Fuel became the only thing that could stop him. His tanks often outpaced supply lines, and more than once Patton raged at Eisenhower and Bradley for denying him priority in gasoline. His view was simple: give me fuel, and I will end this war. Now, with Hitler's armies reeling from Normandy, Patton stood on the edge of greatness. Ahead lay the Falaise pocket, a chance to trap the retreating German 7th Army and deal the Reich a crippling blow. For Patton, it was the very opportunity his life had prepared him to seize. But across the battlefield, not everyone shared his appetite for risk. Montgomery, cautious and deliberate, envisioned a slower, methodical closing of the pocket. Eisenhower, balancing egos and logistics, hesitated, and in that hesitation, thousands of German soldiers would grasp at survival. The stage was set for one of the most bitter what-ifs of the Second World War. The story of General George S. Patton is not a straight line of triumph. It is a jagged path, filled with glory, humiliation, and redemption, a cycle that mirrored the chaos of the war itself. To understand the legend, one must follow the arc of his rise, his devastating fall, and his eventual return as one of America's most formidable commanders. Patton's rise came swiftly in North Africa. In 1942, after the American disaster at Kasserine Pass, morale was shattered. Units were disorganized, and the German Afrika Korps seemed unstoppable. Into this storm walked Patton, a figure larger than life, clad in polished boots, ivory-handled pistols, and a piercing stare that seemed to cut through hesitation itself. His arrival was more than just a change in leadership. It was a shockwave. He enforced discipline with relentless severity, turning ragged soldiers into a force capable of standing toe-to-toe with Rommel's veterans. His command in Tunisia and later in Sicily gave the Allies victories that restored pride to the U.S. Army. He became not just a general, but a symbol of warrior America desperately needed. Yet with Patton's greatness came the fall. Sicily, 1943, in the heat of the campaign, after weeks of relentless combat, he visited a field hospital. There, he encountered exhausted soldiers, men suffering not from physical wounds, but from battle fatigue. To Patton, forged in the old codes of cavalry and honor, fear was the ultimate betrayal. In a moment that would haunt him, he struck the soldiers, accusing them of cowardice. The incident spread quickly, igniting outrage back home. Congress demanded answers. Patton, once America's rising star, was suddenly disgraced, his career hanging by a thread. For a time, it seemed his war was over before it had truly begun. But history often bends in strange ways. From this nadir came the redemption. By 1944, the Allies needed Patton again. The Normandy invasion was complete, but the breakout from France required speed, audacity, and a commander willing to take risks others feared. That man was Patton. With the formation of the U.S. Third Army, he was unleashed across France in a whirlwind of armored thrusts that astonished friend and foe alike. His tanks moved so fast that supply lines strained to keep up. He was back not just as a soldier, but as a legend reborn. This cycle of rise, fall, and redemption forged Patton into something more than a general. He became a paradox, a man both admired and feared, loved and loathed, brilliant yet flawed. It was this contradiction that made him not just a commander of armies, but a figure of myth destined to shape the outcome of a war and leave a legacy that would endure long after his battles were over. When George S. Patton was finally returned to command, it was not with a whisper but with a thunderclap. In August 1944, he was handed the U.S. Third Army, a force that would become the sharpest sword of the Allied drive across Europe. What followed was one of the most breathtaking military pursuits in modern history, a campaign defined by speed, audacity, and an almost reckless faith in momentum. The Third Army did not creep forward, it exploded out of Normandy. Once the breakout at Saint-Lô opened the door, Patton tore through it with a fury unmatched by any other Allied commander. His tanks surged across the French countryside like a flood breaking through a dam. In mere days, divisions that had slogged for weeks in the Bocage were racing hundreds of miles. Bridges were captured before the Germans could demolish them. Villages that had braced for months of occupation awoke to the roar of Sherman engines and the stars and stripes flying once again. Patton's philosophy was simple: attack, attack, and keep attacking. His Third Army advanced so fast that even Allied headquarters struggled to keep up. His men joked that they would catch hell from the Germans for going too far and from the Allies for going too fast. Yet this pace was not mere recklessness, it was calculated chaos. Patton understood that in modern war, speed was a weapon in itself, one that shattered enemy cohesion and paralyzed decision-making. But this lightning war carried a hidden weakness: supply. The Third Army consumed fuel, ammunition, and food at a staggering rate. Soon, the advance began to outstrip the ability of Allied logistics to keep pace. Patton's tanks often halted not from enemy fire, but from empty gas tanks. He fumed as convoys struggled to bring forward fuel from the beaches of Normandy. At one point, Patton famously quipped, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks gotta have gas." Even so, the Third Army pressed on. From the Loire Valley to the Moselle River, they carved a swath of liberation across France. Towns erupted in celebration, villagers showering Patton's columns with flowers, wine, and tears of gratitude. Yet ahead lay tougher ground: the fortified borders of Germany itself, and a Wehrmacht that was battered, but far from beaten. Patton had unleashed his army, and Europe would never be the same. But as autumn approached, the war was entering a new, uncertain phase. The Germans were regrouping. The Allied supply crisis was deepening, and political tensions between commanders threatened to fracture the momentum. Patton had proven the power of speed, but soon he would face a test unlike any before, one that would demand not just audacity, but endurance. The autumn of 1944 should have been a season of triumph for George Patton and his Third Army. France had been liberated in a whirlwind advance. The Germans were retreating toward their homeland, and victory seemed within reach. But as the first snows of winter fell, the war bogged down into a grinding stalemate. For Patton, whose genius thrived on speed and relentless attack, this was agony. The problem was not courage, nor strategy, it was supply. The Allies had outrun their logistics. Fuel, ammunition, and rations had to be hauled hundreds of miles over bombed-out railways and wrecked roads. The Red Ball Express, a vast trucking operation manned largely by African-American soldiers, did its best to feed Patton's hungry divisions, but the need always outstripped the supply. Tanks that had raced across France now sat idle, their crews staring at empty fuel gauges. Patton fumed. To him, The enemy was cornered, reeling, vulnerable. Every delay was wasted opportunity. Yet he was forced to slow his spearheads, waiting for gasoline that never arrived in time. He raged at Eisenhower's decision to prioritize Montgomery's push toward the Ruhr in the north, convinced that had his Third Army been given full support, he could have driven straight into Germany and ended the war before Christmas. The men of the Third Army felt the frustration too. They endured bitter winds and icy mud in foxholes along the Moselle. Watching German defenses stiffen before their eyes, patrols turned into bloody skirmishes in fog-choked forests. Morale dipped as the promise of a swift end to the war faded into a cold, uncertain winter. Patton, ever conscious of his soldier's spirit, visited the front constantly, his gleaming helmet, ivory-handled pistols, and fiery speeches cutting through the gloom. He urged his troops to hold fast, to endure, to remember that fatigue makes cowards of us all. Yet beneath his defiance, even Patton felt the weight of frustration. He was a general of movement, a master of pursuit, forced into a war of attrition. Every day of delay gave the Germans time to rebuild, to dig in, to prepare. And though no one yet knew it, Hitler was planning something bold, something that would turn the Ardennes into the crucible of the war. For now, however, the Third Army sat in the cold, its fury bottled, its momentum stalled, and its commander straining against the leash of circumstance. Winter had come to Europe, and with it, the first real pause in Patton's relentless march. But the storm gathering on the horizon would soon give him the chance to prove that, even in the darkest hours, he could turn frustration into fire. The Allies thought the Germans were finished. By December 1944, intelligence painted a picture of a collapsing Reich factories in ruins, cities smoldering from Allied bombs, and an army on the retreat. Snow blanketed the Ardennes, a region so rugged and forested that American commanders dismissed it as unsuitable for major operations. They thinned their lines there, placing exhausted or inexperienced divisions in what they believed was a quiet sector. But in Berlin, Hitler was gambling everything on one last throw of the dice. He called it Whacked am Rhine the Ardennes offensive. His plan was audacious: punch through the American lines, seize Antwerp, split the Allied armies, and force a negotiated peace. It was a desperate gamble, but if it succeeded, it could change the course of the war. At dawn on December 16, 1944, the silence of the Ardennes shattered. Thousands of German artillery pieces roared at once, pounding American positions. The frozen earth trembled as shells exploded among pine forests and sleepy villages. From the woods, German infantry surged forward, veterans in white camouflage smocks, supported by Panthers and Tiger tanks that rolled through the snow like steel predators. The attack fell on the thinly stretched lines of the U.S. The 8th Corps, youngest. Many barely out of training, were caught completely off guard. Fog and snow grounded Allied aircraft, depriving them of their greatest advantage. Communications broke down. Entire regiments were surrounded in towns like Clairvaux and St. Vith. Desperate Americans fought house to house, buying precious time with their lives. The offensive created a massive dent in the Allied frontal bulge that would give the battle its famous name, the Battle of the Bulge. In those first days, chaos reigned. Columns of retreating American troops clogged icy roads. Stories spread of German soldiers disguised in U.S. uniforms sowing confusion. Fuel dumps were captured. The fear of encirclement hung heavy. For Eisenhower and his high command, the attack was a shock. Months of confidence collapsed overnight. Could the Germans really turn the tide? Among the generals, one man saw not just crisis, but opportunity: George S. Patton. As others reeled, Patton prepared to move. While the Ardennes blazed, his mind raced ahead, already plotting the counterstroke that might save the Allied line. On December 19, 1944, as the German offensive widened into a terrifying bulge on Allied maps, the supreme commanders gathered in an ancient fortress city steeped in history of Verdun, France. The choice was symbolic. Verdun, the graveyard of empires in 1916, was again the setting for a desperate struggle where the fate of Europe hung in the balance. The atmosphere in the room was grim. Field Marshal Montgomery in the north warned of collapse if reinforcements didn't arrive. Bradley, whose forces bore the brunt of the attack, appeared shaken by the scale of the German thrust. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, sat at the head of the table, his face pale with the weight of responsibility. Maps covered in thick red arrows showed the German advance cutting dangerously close to the Meuse River. The question was stark: how could they stop Hitler's last gamble before it shattered the Allied front? In that smoke-filled room, one voice cut through hesitation: General George S. Patton. Unlike others who saw only retreat, Patton spoke with fire. He insisted that the German attack, though powerful, was also reckless. Their columns were stretching thin, their fuel was limited, and their window of opportunity was closing fast. What the Allies needed was not a defensive crouch, but a decisive counterblow. Eisenhower leaned forward. "How soon can you disengage and turn your army north to strike the enemy flank?" he asked. Most generals would have demanded weeks. Roads were choked with snow, supply lines tangled, and Patton's Third Army was facing German forces in Lorraine. But Patton had anticipated this very moment. He stunned the room with his reply, "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The room went silent. Some thought it was bravado. Others realized they were witnessing something extraordinary. Patton had already prepared contingency plans, issuing orders before the meeting. Gambling on Eisenhower's decision, his staff had drafted routes, fuel allocations, and marching orders. The Third Army, an entire armored juggernaut, was already poised to pivot like a massive machine, waiting for the signal. Eisenhower, recognizing both audacity and the necessity, gave his approval. "Do it." In that moment, the course of the battle shifted. As Hitler's panzers pushed deeper into Belgium, the Allies unleashed their most aggressive commander. Patton would march north, through ice and snow, toward a small Belgian town soon to become immortal, Bastogne. The desperate gamble of Hitler had met the audacity of Patton, and the clash was about to decide the fate of the Western Front. As the meeting at Verdun broke up, Eisenhower's words still echoed in the minds of the commanders. "Do it." Yet while most men in that fortress were still digesting the enormity of Patton's pledge, the reality was that the wheels were already turning. Patton's genius was not just in bold proclamations, it was in preparation. Long before the German offensive erupted, he had drilled his staff in the art of contingency planning. At his headquarters, every possible German move had been imagined, counter moves drafted, routes mapped, and fuel allocations calculated. His officers jokingly referred to them as war games on paper, but Patton treated them as scripture. Thus, when Eisenhower asked the impossible and army-wide turn and assault in 48 hours, Patton was able to answer with confidence, because the plan was not a dream, it was already in motion. Even before he left Verdun, coded orders were rushing across teletypes and field radios. Third Army units in Lorraine, still locked in combat with German divisions, received shocking instructions: cease offensive operations, disengage, and pivot north. Staff officers, already briefed days earlier on possible redeployment, opened sealed envelopes that contained precise marching orders. In icy motor pools, tank crews scrambled to refuel their Shermans and check tracks for the grueling winter road march. Ahead, convoys of supply trucks began rerouting northward. Packed with gasoline, rations, and ammunition, engineers scouted roads, preparing to clear snow and repair bridges. Traffic officers rehearsed movements to prevent chaos as thousands of vehicles converged on a single axis of advance. To an outsider, it looked like organized chaos. To Patton, it was the orchestra of war coming alive. He moved among his men with his usual fire, riding in his command car, barking encouragement and orders. Soldiers, cold and exhausted, felt a surge of energy at his presence. They knew their commander was about to throw them into the heart of the storm, but they also knew Patton had never led them to defeat. In the north, the situation grew dire. At Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division hastily rushed into position was already encircled by German armor. Supplies were dwindling, the winter growing harsher by the hour. Eisenhower's high command feared the airborne troops could be crushed before relief arrived. But Patton's gamble had set a clock in motion. 3 divisions his spearhead were already rumbling forward. Despite snow, ice, and frozen roads, the Third Army was turning like a great beast, its claws aimed directly at the German flank. Patton once wrote, "Luck is what happens when preparation meets opportunity." In the winter of 1944, as the Ardennes burned, his preparations had collided with Hitler's opportunity, and now, the fate of Bastogne and perhaps the war itself would depend on how fast Patton's army could move. The decision had been made. Patton's Third Army, which had been grinding eastward toward the Saar with methodical fury, would do something that few commanders in history had ever dared attempt: pivot nearly 90 degrees in mid-campaign and hurl itself northward into the teeth of the German offensive. It was not just bold, it was audacious to the point of madness. Entire armies were not meant to turn on a dime. Supply lines had been carefully laid out, fuel dumps placed for a different direction of war, artillery mapped for different fields of fire. To swing an entire army like a great iron door across the battlefield required speed, precision, and unshakable confidence. But Patton had prepared for this moment. while others debated whether the German assault was a desperate gamble or a genuine threat. He had already rehearsed responses in his own mind. When Eisenhower asked how quickly he could disengage divisions and send them north, Patton's answer stunned the room. "I can attack with 3 divisions in 48 hours. The High Command thought it impossible. Shifting tens of thousands of men, hundreds of tanks, artillery pieces, and supply trains across frozen, snow-choked roads should have taken weeks, but Patton's staff, drilled relentlessly under his demanding hand, snapped into action. Orders crackled across the radios, columns turned. Engineers began clearing ice and snow. What had seemed impossible on paper began to move like clockwork on the ground. As the Third Army rolled north, the soldiers knew they were part of something extraordinary. Convoys stretched for miles, headlights piercing the snowy gloom. Tank destroyers rattled on icy roads. Half-tracks churned through slush, and G's stomped their feet against the cold as they rode northward into a storm both natural and man-made. The men were tired, cold, and hungry, but the urgency in the air was unmistakable. For the 101st Airborne Division trapped in Bastogne, time was running out. The news tightened daily. German artillery raining shells on the frozen town. Paratroopers digging ever deeper into their foxholes. Supplies were scarce, medical care nearly non-existent, and the enemy was pressing from all sides. Patton knew every arm mattered. The Germans had gambled everything on the Ardennes offensive, and if Bastogne fell, the road to Antwerp would lie open. Victory or defeat for the Allies could pivot on that single point, and so the Third Army moved faster, farther, and harder than anyone thought possible. What history would later call the Great Turn North was, in truth, less a maneuver and more a force of will, imposed by one general on his men and on the battlefield itself. Patton had unleashed his army, and nothing, not the snow, not the terrain, not even the surprise of Hitler's last great offensive would keep them from their goal. Snow fell in thick curtains as the long columns of Third Army vehicles groaned northward. The landscape was a blur of white and gray villages buried under drifts, forests standing like silent witnesses, and roads so slick that every mile gained felt like a minor miracle. Men huddled in trucks, breath steaming in the frozen air, clutching rifles and ration tins. The world was cold, hungry, and merciless, and yet there was one figure who seemed untouched by despair: Patton. Unlike many commanders who remained behind at heated headquarters, Patton was everywhere. He insisted on riding forward, pushing past convoys, surprising troops in frozen foxholes, shouting encouragement from the roadside. His famous ivory-handled pistols gleamed even beneath the slate sky, symbols of defiance against the winter and the enemy alike. To the men, his presence was electric. Tank crews working in the biting wind looked up to see their general stomping through the snow, checking their guns, asking if they had eaten. Infantrymen, trudging with numb feet and frostbitten hands, heard his gravelly voice bark, "Keep moving. You'll warm up when you fight." Even his harsh words carried strange comfort, the assurance that their suffering had purpose. Patton's genius was not just strategy, but morale. He understood that men in war did not fight only for ideals or flags. They fought for each other, and often for the leaders they believed in. And so, when they saw their general enduring the same snow, the same cold winds, they drew strength from it. On one bitter night near Edelbruck, as an armored column struggled to keep vehicles moving on icy slopes, Patton personally climbed from his jeep and directed traffic with a flashlight, shouting at drivers, urging them forward. An officer protested. "General, this isn't your job." Patton growled back, "My job is to get this army to Bastogne. Now move these damn trucks." Stories like these spread like wildfire through the ranks. By the time the first vanguard neared Bastogne, Third Army's soldiers were no longer just marching, they were charging, carried forward by a sense that history itself was watching, and their general was leading from the front. In the frozen Ardennes, where courage could falter and men could break, Patton gave them something more precious than fuel or ammunition: belief. For all the boldness of Hitler's Ardennes gamble, the plan contained within it the seeds of its own failure. What looked on the maps in Berlin like a swift, decisive thrust to Antwerp had, in reality, been built on fragile assumptions, each of which began to crumble under the weight of the campaign itself. The first and greatest miscalculation was time. Hitler believed his panzers could slice through the thin American lines, seize the vital road junctions, and break open a path before the Allies could react. But he had underestimated the speed and resilience of the American command. Within days, Eisenhower and his generals, Patton foremost, among them, had shifted entire armies with breathtaking agility. The Germans expected paralysis. Instead, they encountered a force that bent but did not break. The second miscalculation was logistics. The Wehrmacht of 1944 was no longer the unstoppable blitzkrieg machine of 1940. German fuel reserves were dangerously low. Many tanks rolled into battle with barely enough gasoline for the advance, their commanders gambling on capturing Allied fuel dumps along the way. When the Americans torched those supplies rather than surrender them, the German spearheads began to sputter. Fearsome Tiger tanks and Panthers were abandoned in snowy fields not defeated by enemy fire, but by empty fuel tanks. The third flaw lay in underestimating American soldiers. German intelligence had painted the U.S. Army as inexperienced, soft, unlikely to stand and fight, but in Bastogne, in the frozen foxholes of the Ardennes, and along every stretch of road where G has set up makeshift defenses, the reality was very different. Underdogs though they were, the Americans fought stubbornly, delaying the advance hour by hour, mile by mile. Every roadblock, every ambush, every squad of riflemen slowed the German timetable until lightning war became a sluggish crawl. And finally, the Germans had misjudged the weather. At first, heavy snow and low clouds shielded them from Allied air power, giving the offensive a chance to strike unseen. But Hitler had gambled on winter lasting in his favor. When the skies cleared in late December, the thunder of Allied aircraft returned. Bombers pounded supply routes, fighters strafed convoys, and suddenly the German advance, already strained, became a death march. By the time Patton's Third Army turned north and began to smash into the German flank, it was becoming clear the Great Ardennes gamble had run out of momentum. What had begun with confidence and fury was turning into a desperate struggle for survival. The German miscalculation was not simply tactical, it was strategic, even psychological. Hitler believed he could shatter Allied unity with one blow, that the Americans could be frightened into retreat. Instead, his offensive had unified the Allies with renewed determination and had unleashed Patton's fury upon the battlefield. The tide was turning. The small Belgian town of Bastogne was never meant to be the focal point of one of the most dramatic sieges of the war. Yet, as German armored spearheads pushed westward in December 1944, Bastogne's significance became undeniable. Nestled amid dense forests and snowbound hills, it sat at the crossroads of 7 vital highways. Whoever held Bastogne controlled the arteries of movement in the Ardennes. For Hitler's plan to succeed, Bastogne had to fall swiftly. Instead, it became a fortress. When the German advance surged forward, the U.S. 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored Division and other units, rushed into the town. They were under strength, short on supplies, and exhausted from weeks of combat. But they carried with them the spirit that had come to define American resistance, a refusal to yield ground, no matter the odds. By December 20th, Bastogne was encircled. The siege began with fury. German tanks and infantry pressed in from all sides, tightening the noose. Artillery rained down on the defenders, while the bitter cold gnawed at men huddled in foxholes and ruined houses. Food was scarce, medical supplies scarcer still, and ammunition was carefully rationed. The wounded lay in cellars, tended to by overworked medics with little more than morphine and bandages. Yet the men of Bastogne held. They fought delaying actions on the outskirts, ambushing tanks in the forests, sniping from concealed positions, and counterattacking whenever the line wavered. Their defense was not flawless. Several positions were overrun, and the perimeter bent alarmingly under pressure, but it never broke. The siege reached its most famous moment on December 22nd. German envoys approached under a white flag, bearing an ultimatum: surrender Bastogne or face complete destruction. The American commander, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, read the demand, smiled grimly, and scribbled his reply: nuts. The single word, baffling to the Germans, electrified the defenders. It became a rallying cry, a symbol that Bastogne would never submit. But defiance alone could not keep men alive. The winter was merciless. Temperatures plummeted, snowstorms howled through the forests, and frostbite claimed nearly as many soldiers as bullets. Resupply was impossible by road, so the defenders looked skyward. When the weather cleared just enough, Allied C-47s roared overhead, parachuting crates of food, medical gear, and ammunition into the besieged town. Men cheered, tears freezing on their faces as lifelines drifted down from the heavens. Still, the pressure mounted. German armor probed constantly, searching for weak spots. Panzer units launched repeated assaults, sometimes reaching the very outskirts of the town. The defenders fought with bazookas, rifles, even captured German weapons, anything to blunt the attacks. Each day, Each night, the encircled Americans wondered, would relief come before their strength gave out? What they did not know was that Patton had already set his army in motion against every prediction. He had wheeled the Third Army northward in days, not weeks. As Bastogn's defenders clung on by sheer willpower, Patton's columns were driving through snow-choked roads, fighting against German forces desperate to stop them. The town's fate now hung in the balance of that race. Bastogne was no longer just a town. It was a symbol. To the Germans, it was the key to victory. To the Allies, it was proof that no encirclement, no storm, no enemy could break their spirit. The siege would not last forever. One army was coming. The snow was still falling when General Patton's Third Army shifted its momentum northward. His men had been pushing relentlessly, their boots crunching across the frozen ground, their vehicles crawling through ice-slick roads barely wide enough to accommodate the armored columns. Every mile forward was paid for in sweat, steel, and blood. But Patton had promised relief to the paratroopers trapped at Bastogne, and now the promise was being put to the ultimate test. For days, the men of the 101st Airborne had been surrounded, their supplies dwindling, their wounded piling up in makeshift aid stations. They fought back wave after wave of German attacks, but their fate depended on forces they could not see. Deep inside Bastogne, the word spread, Patton is coming. Patton's plan for the relief was as aggressive as it was audacious. The 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey, would spearhead the attack north. Their objective: break through the German lines and open a corridor into Bastogne. But the terrain was against them. Snow-choked forests and frozen rivers funneled his tanks into predictable paths, and the Germans had fortified every road and village with anti-tank guns, artillery, and infantry determined to hold the encirclement. On December 22, 1944, the 4th Armored began their assault. At every bend in the road, German defenses slowed their progress. Machine guns rattled from farmhouses, mines destroyed tanks, artillery rained down from hidden positions. The advance was grueling, measured in yards rather than miles. Patton, restless at his command post, demanded updates almost by the hour. His message to Gaffey was simple: move faster. The 101st waits for no man. The pressure weighed heavily on the troops. The winter cold froze their weapons. Men wrapped rags around their feet when boots gave out. Tank crews fought with visibility reduced to near zero in snowstorms. Yet morale remained unbroken because they knew what was at stake. By December 23rd, skies finally cleared, and American air power roared into action. Fighters and bombers strafed German positions, smashed convoys, and dropped much-needed supplies into Bastogne. For the first time, the defenders in Bastogne and the attackers pushing north felt the tide turning. Still, progress was slow. Villages like Chaumont and Bougainville became death traps. Every house was a fortress, every hedgerow a defensive line. The men of the 4th Armored Division advanced under constant fire, at times reduced to bitter, close-quarters fighting. The Germans fought with equal desperation, knowing their success at Bastogne was the linchpin of the Ardennes offensive. Finally, on December 26, 1944, after days of bitter combat, Lieutenant Charles Boggess, leading the small tank column of the 37th Tank Battalion, pushed into the village of Assenois. From there, the road to Bastogne lay open. His tank rumbled forward, its treads grinding over the frozen snow, until at last it rolled into the perimeter held by the 101st Airborne. The link was made. Bastogne had been relieved. For the paratroopers, the sight of American armor was more than just salvation. It was proof that they had not been forgotten. Men wept openly. Supplies poured in. Wounded were evacuated. The siege was broken. Patton, upon hearing the news, offered no theatrics. His satisfaction was contained in a single remark: "Well, that's that." But in truth, the relief of Bastogne was more than a tactical victory. It was a symbolic turning point. The German offensive, once threatening to split the Allied lines, had now been blunted. The bulge was collapsing. Yet for the men who fought through snow, hunger, and exhaustion, the relief was not an ending, but a beginning. The Battle of the Ardennes was far from over. The push back against the German tide was only now beginning in earnest, and Patton's army would be at the center of it. The Ardennes, December 1944. The fields and forests lay blanketed in snow, the air thick with fog that clung stubbornly to the hills and valleys. For the Allies, the weather was more than an inconvenience, it was a curse. Planes that could have ripped through German columns on the roads, tanks that could have maneuvered with precision, artillery that could have fired with accuracy, all were hamstringed by the relentless winter storm. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne clung to survival, short on food, ammunition, and medical supplies. Every day, German artillery rained shells onto the surrounded town, and every night, the paratroopers dug deeper into frozen ground, shivering in their foxholes. Relief was coming, but not fast enough, and over all of it hung a single, desperate hope that the skies would clear. General George S. Patton, commanding the U.S. Third Army, understood this better than anyone. His men were advancing with ferocity, carving a path north toward Bastogne, but without the aid of Allied air power, the odds of breaking the German grip seemed perilously slim. Patton was a man of action, a man who believed in movement, momentum, and willpower, but here, even he was powerless before the weather, and so he turned to something unusual. On December 23rd, in a small chapel in Luxembourg, Patton summoned his Third Army chaplain, James O'Neill. The general's presence was commanding as always, but that day there was an urgency behind his eyes. He instructed O'Neill to write a prayer not for victory, but for the weather itself, specifically for a break in the storm. The chaplain hesitated. He had written prayers for strength, for courage, even for peace, but for weather, that was God's domain, untouchable by human petition. Yet Patton was insistent. This is for the men. Chaplain, they need it. I need it. And so, Chaplain O'Neill composed the words. Patton had the prayer printed on cards and distributed to every man in the Third Army. Thousands of soldiers, hardened by months of fighting, found themselves holding that slip of paper in their frostbitten hands, whispering the words under their breath as they trudged through snow and mud. It was a curious sight, an army of tanks and guns and steel, pausing in the dead of winter to ask for clear skies. Then, almost miraculously, the weather began to shift. On December 23rd, the fog lifted, the skies cleared, the roar of Allied bombers and fighter planes filled the air, striking German convoys, strafing supply lines, hammering artillery positions. For the first time since the offensive began, the full weight of Allied air superiority was unleashed upon the enemy in Bastogne. Parachutes blossomed across the sky, supply drops bringing food, ammunition, and medical kits to the embattled 101st. The defenders cheered as the crates landed, their desperate stand now buoyed by fresh lifelines from above. Patton himself was quick to take credit. To him, it was proof of his unshakable belief that fortune favored the bold. That faith combined with action could alter the course of war. To his men, it was a sign that maybe, just maybe, they were not entirely alone in that frozen hell. The Germans, for their part, now faced a nightmare. Their once secretive advance was laid bare under the crystal-clear skies. Every movement was hunted, every column bombed, every road turned into a graveyard of burning vehicles. What had been their greatest ally, the weather, had suddenly betrayed them. For the Americans, it was more than just sunshine. It was hope. It was the turning of the tide. The Ardennes offensive had begun with a storm that cloaked German ambition. Now, it was unraveling beneath a sky cleared by prayer. Christmas Eve, 1944, snow fell relentlessly over the Ardennes, smothering the land in a silence that was broken only by the distant thunder of artillery. In Bastogne, the 101st Airborne still clung desperately to life. Food was scarce, ammunition low, and the wounded filled every cellar and barn. Yet their defiance held firm, their answer to the German surrender demand echoing across history. Nuts. But to the north, something was stirring. Patton's Third Army, after days of clawing through snow-choked roads and battling against fierce German resistance, was finally in position. The weather had cleared just enough for air support to resume, and Patton knew this was the moment. On the morning of December 26th, columns of Shermans and armored infantry pressed forward. The sound of tank treads biting into frozen earth, the roar of engines, and the crack of rifles signaled that the drive to Bastogne had reached its crescendo. The 4th Armored Division spearheaded the assault, pushing through villages turned into fortresses, where German defenders fought with fanatical resolve. Each crossroad was a battle, every hedgerow a death trap. Inside Bastogne, the men of the 101st strained to hold out one more day, unaware of just how close salvation was. At dusk, the first American tanks from the 37th Tank Battalion massed through the German lines at the Senois. As they rumbled down the road toward Bastogne, weary paratroopers emerged from foxholes and ruined buildings, their frozen faces breaking into smiles. Cheers erupted, and men who had been hardened by days of relentless fighting and cold embraced their rescuers. For Patton, the relief of Bastogne was more than a tactical success, it was a vindication of his daring, his ability to turn an army on its axis and drive it with relentless force. Through impossible conditions, he had promised Eisenhower he could reach Bastogne in 48 hours, and though it had taken a few days longer, the effect was undeniable. The battered bastards of Bastogne had been saved, and the German gamble was unraveling. That Christmas night, the Ardennes was lit not by festive candles, but by the fires of battle. Yet for the men of the 101st and the Third Army, it was a Christmas miracle forged in blood, steel, and unyielding willpower. The tide of the Battle of the Bulge was beginning to turn. The relief of Bastogne had not ended the battle, it had only shifted its form. By late December 1944, the Ardennes had become a cauldron where German hopes slowly boiled away. Hitler's grand offensive, designed to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace, was dissolving into a war of attrition. The German army, battered but unyielding, continued to pour men and machines into the fight. Panzer divisions that had once raced confidently toward the Meuse were now trapped in a slog, their fuel nearly gone, their strength eroded. Every village, every snow-covered ridge, turned into a killing ground. The Ardennes was no longer a battlefield of maneuver, it was a grinder, chewing up men on both sides. For the Americans, the fighting was no less brutal. Entire companies froze in foxholes, their rifles stiff with ice. Shells burst in treetops, sending wooden splinters and shrapnel raining down in a storm of death. Casualty lists grew longer each day, and reinforcements were fed into the lines as quickly as trucks could deliver them. In the north, Montgomery's forces pressed from above, while in the south Patton hammered relentlessly forward. The Germans found themselves squeezed, their once mighty bolts collapsing under pressure. But as the front lines constricted, the fighting intensified. Towns like Hofelize and St. Vith became synonymous with slaughter, streets clogged with burning tanks, the snow blackened with soot and stained with blood. The Luftwaffe made one last desperate gamble with Operation Bodenplatte on New Year's Day, sending waves of aircraft to strike Allied airfields. Though the raids destroyed planes on the ground, the Germans paid dearly in pilots they could not replace. By the time the smoke cleared, Allied air superiority was unquestionable. What had begun as Hitler's boldest strike had devolved into a nightmare. German soldiers starved in the snow, their fuel drums empty, their commanders furious but powerless. American and British units, bloodied but growing stronger, ground them down day by day. The Ardennes had become a meat grinder where the last reserves of the Reich were being annihilated. For the Allies, victory was not yet complete, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. The bulge was shrinking. The question was not if the Germans would be beaten, but how long they could endure it before the trap snapped shut. By early January 1945, the grand gamble of Hitler's Ardennes offensive lay in ruins. What had begun as a sudden spear thrust toward the Meuse had devolved into a retreat fought in desperation. The bulge that had so threatened the Allied line was collapsing inward, squeezed from north and south like a vice. In the south, Patton's Third Army surged relentlessly forward, pushing through battered German lines despite snowstorms, wrecked roads, and fanatical resistance. His men advanced village by village, clearing dug-in defenders with rifles, grenades, and flamethrowers. In the north, Montgomery's British and American forces closed from above, cutting off escape routes and tightening the noose. The once dangerous salient shrank with each passing day. For the German soldiers, conditions bordered on hell. Their armored divisions, already weakened by fuel shortages, now found themselves abandoned in fields and villages as their tanks sputtered to a halt. Horses were pressed into service to drag artillery. A grim echo of World War I. Exhausted men stumbled through the forests, frostbitten and starving, retreating not toward victory, but survival. The Allies, though battered, had regained their momentum. Fresh divisions arrived. Artillery boomed ceaselessly, and Allied planes once again ruled the skies. With clear weather restored, bombers and fighters strafed columns of retreating Germans, scattering men and machines in chaos. The snow-covered landscape became littered with burned-out armor, shattered trucks, and frozen corpses. One by one, key towns that had anchored the German advance fell. Hofelize became a deadly bottleneck as retreating units clashed with advancing Allied armor. St. Vith, once a vital crossroads, was finally abandoned. Even Bastogne, once encircled, now stood as a bastion of Allied strength, from which counterattacks radiated outward. By mid-January, the bulge that had once driven deep into Belgium was nearly gone. The German line had not only been pushed back to its starting point, but weakened irreparably. Hitler's last major offensive in the West had failed, leaving behind nothing but wreckage. casualties, and a strategic disaster from which the Reich would never recover. The Ardennes had cost the Allies dearly, tens of thousands of dead and wounded, and months of delay in their final push into Germany. But for the Wehrmacht, it was a mortal wound. The Bulge had collapsed, and with it, any illusion that Nazi Germany could reverse the tide of war. The road to the Rhine now lay open. The Battle of the Bulge ended not with a single dramatic moment, but with a steady grinding down of the German war machine until its defeat was undeniable. By the end of January 1945, the Ardennes was once again under Allied control. The snow-covered fields and shattered villages bore silent witness to one of the most brutal clashes of the Western Front. For the Allies, the victory carried a dual legacy. On the one hand, it was proof of resilience. The American army, still relatively young compared to its British counterpart, had withstood the greatest German offensive of the war and emerged stronger. Units that had been thrown into chaos during the opening days regrouped, counterattacked, and eventually drove the enemy back. Bastogne became a symbol of defiance, Patton's relief march a legend, and the GI's determination a testament to the strength of citizen soldiers. But the cost was staggering. Over 80,000 American casualties killed, wounded, or missing made the Bulge the bloodiest battle the U.S. Army would fight in World War II. British losses added thousands more. For many soldiers, the Ardennes was a winter of nightmares that haunted them for the rest of their lives. Frostbite took almost as many men as enemy bullets. For Germany, the legacy was ruin. Hitler's gamble had squandered the last reserves of armor, fuel, and manpower that might have slowed the Allied advance. The once feared panzer divisions were reduced to hollow shells. Thousands of irreplaceable veteran soldiers lay dead in the snow. The Reich had not only lost the battle, but also its final chance to dictate the course of the war in the West. From this point forward, Germany would fight only in retreat. Strategically, the Ardennes marked a turning point. The Allies, though bruised, regained the initiative and never relinquished it. Within weeks, they crossed the Rhine and surged into the heart of Germany. The Soviets, advancing from the east, soon began their final drive toward Berlin. The failure of the Bulge ensured that the Third Reich's collapse was only a matter of time. Yet, beyond strategy and numbers, the battle's legacy was also human. For the men who fought there, the Ardennes was remembered not only as a test of endurance, but also of brotherhood. Stories of foxhole friendships, last-ditch stands, and quiet acts of courage echoed long after the war ended. The frozen forests of Belgium became hallowed ground, a place where ordinary soldiers performed extraordinary deeds. In the years to come, historians would argue about Hitler's intentions, the Allied response, and the tactical lessons of the Ardennes. But to those who had lived through it, the meaning was simpler. In the darkest days of winter, when the outcome seemed uncertain, determination had prevailed. The Bulge was not just a victory on the battlefield, it was a triumph of will. And as January snows gave way to spring, the soldiers who had endured that crucible carried with them the knowledge that they had fought in the last great German offensive of the war. The Bulge had collapsed. The Reich was bleeding out, and the path to final victory now stretched clear ahead. When the smoke cleared over the Ardennes and the forest slowly thawed, the final truth of the Battle of the Bulge revealed itself. It was not just a clash of tanks and men, nor simply Hitler's last gamble. It was the moment when the fate of Nazi Germany was sealed beyond doubt. The truth was brutal. The Third Reich no longer had the power to shape the war. The Bulge had drained its last reserves. Its once vaunted panzer divisions, rebuilt with such effort, lay shattered. The fuel that had been hoarded for months was burned away in a futile thrust that gained nothing lasting, and the German soldier, who had fought with desperate courage, had been sacrificed in a gamble that could never succeed. For the Allies, the truth was also sobering. Victory had not come easily. It was bought with tens of thousands of lives, with frozen bodies in foxholes, and with shattered towns left in ruin. The myth of an easy march to Berlin had died in the Ardennes. The Americans and British had learned that even a cornered enemy could still strike with terrifying force. But perhaps the greatest truth lay in what the Bulge revealed about willpower. Hitler had gambled on breaking Allied unity, believing the Americans were soft and unwilling to endure hardship. The battle proved him wrong. In the snow and chaos, the GI did not break. Instead, they endured, fought back, and showed that the United States Army, an army of clerks, farmers, and mechanics in uniform, could withstand the harshest test and still prevail. The battle also exposed the hollowness of Hitler's vision. What was meant to divide the Allies only strengthened their resolve. Churchill and Roosevelt stood firmer with Stalin after seeing the Scale of the German gamble. The final truth was that Germany's defeat was not only inevitable, but imminent. The Ardennes did not delay the end of the war, it hastened it. In the decades that followed, survivors of the Bulge often struggled to explain what they had endured. They spoke of frozen nights, of shells bursting in the trees, of friends lost in sudden moments of violence. Yet through it all, they carried the knowledge that they had stood firm when history demanded it. The final truth of the Bulge is this: it was not just a battle of weapons, but of spirit. It showed the world that in the face of desperation, courage and endurance could prevail. And it marked the beginning of the end for Hitler's Reich. From the snowy forests of Belgium, the road to Berlin was open, and with it, the final chapter of World War II in Europe began.